When most people think of World War II engineering, they picture tanks, planes and weaponry. But, the real brilliance often came from soldiers and engineers working under pressure. Men who had to create protection from nothing but mud, timber and grit. These weren't luxury fortifications. They were shelters built in days, sometimes hours, under bombardment and starvation. Yet many of these World War II shelter designs were so effective that even today they outperform some modern bunkers when it comes to insulation, concealment and sustainability. These designs weren't just about surviving the war. They were about mastering the art of endurance. What's fascinating is how the principles behind these shelters are still used today in disaster survival, off-grid architecture and even military design. The dugout shelter was the backbone of survival and stealth. The most iconic and effective World War II shelter wasn't above ground at all. It was below it. The dugout, known as a foxhole in its simplest form, or an earth shelter when expanded, was the soldier's best defence against artillery and air raids. But its genius lay in its adaptability. Troops learned to carve these shelters deep enough to regulate temperature, prevent flooding and withstand explosions. A properly built dugout had an entrance trench sloping downward, a sleeping platform carved from packed earth, and a ceiling reinforced with logs and soil, often layered with sandbags to absorb shockwaves. These designs still inspire modern off-grid survival shelters. The principle is simple. Use the ground as insulation. Earth absorbs heat slowly, keeping interiors warm in winter and cool in summer. In a practical setting, someone building an emergency shelter today could use the same concept by digging into a hillside, reinforcing the roof with logs and sealing the top with a waterproof tarp or clay mixture. The physics hasn't changed. Soil remains one of the most efficient natural insulators, and World War II soldiers mastered that long before the term eco-shelter existed. The log and earth bunker proved that simplicity beats steel under pressure. When steel was scarce and concrete too heavy to transport, soldiers turned to the materials around them, mainly timber and soil. The log and earth bunker was a marvel of wartime necessity and natural engineering. Soldiers stacked logs horizontally, alternating the direction of each layer like massive wooden bricks. Between layers they packed soil, clay and sometimes gravel, creating a dense composite structure that absorbed shockwaves and muffled sound. These bunkers could take direct mortar hits without collapsing, a feat of structural flexibility that modern rigid bunkers often fail to replicate. This concept actually lives on in sustainable building techniques today, especially in things like rammed earth and cordwood construction. Both of these methods use natural compression and organic materials to create structures that are not only durable, but also breathable. If you were to try replicating a World War II-style bunker nowadays, whether for survival or maybe research, you'd start by selecting thick, straight logs, interlocking them in layers and filling the gaps with compacted soil. And when you seal it all up with tar or clay on the roof, it becomes practically airtight and self-supporting. Really, it's proof that ancient craftsmanship and wartime ingenuity still hold up in the 21st century. The sandbag fortification, well, it turned mobility into a bit of a defensive science. Not all shelters were meant to be permanent, you see. On the front lines, soldiers needed cover that could be assembled, dismantled and rebuilt within hours. The sandbag fortification became a real lifesaver. It was light to transport, versatile, and when used properly, incredibly durable. What made it truly special was the way soldiers learned to shape it. By stacking sandbags in a staggered brick pattern, slanting the walls just slightly inward, and layering tarps or canvas between every few rows, they created barriers that could absorb shock and shed rainwater too. When these were built into small bunkers or gun nests, the walls could actually deflect small arms fire and resist collapse far better than concrete of the same thickness. Today, humanitarian groups still use this design for flood control in field hospitals and at military outposts. Even modern preppers rely on it for temporary defensive shelters. The key, really, is density. You never want to overfill the bags, and you've got to stack them tight enough so they compress under their own weight. World War II engineers figured out that this balance of weight and flexibility was absolutely crucial. Their field manuals even included diagrams showing how sandbags could stop a .30 caliber bullet. And honestly, those same principles still apply to ballistic and impact protection today. Ah, the snow cave. It saved more lives in those freezing fronts than any blanket ever could. Truly remarkable. On the Eastern Front and in Arctic campaigns, soldiers faced temperatures that, well, they killed faster than bullets. You see, conventional shelters, they failed miserably in those conditions. But snow, oddly enough, became their salvation. Soldiers learned to carve snow caves using compacted drifts and ice layers, creating chambers that trapped body heat and blocked the wind. The trick, really, was to make the entrance tunnel lower than the main sleeping area so that cold air sank below while warm air stayed near the top. They even used burning tallow lamps or ration cans filled with fuel paste for minimal heat without melting the walls. Quite ingenious, if you ask me. This technique, well, it's still used in modern cold-weather survival training because it's scientifically sound, you know. Snow acts as both an insulator and a sound barrier. Even in -30 degrees Celsius conditions, the temperature inside a snow cave can hover just below freezing, enough to keep a soldier or mountaineer alive through the night. You can apply the same principle in modern survival scenarios by shaping snow into a dome or tunnel system, always venting a small hole at the top for airflow. It's one of the purest examples of natural physics turned into survival craft. Fascinating, isn't it? The camouflage trench proved that invisibility is sometimes the best armor. During the Second World War, visibility often determined who lived and who didn't. The camouflage trench evolved as a result, part shelter, part deception. Soldiers dug narrow, low-profile trenches and covered them with local vegetation, woven netting and mud-stained cloth. Some units went further, shaping their bunkers to blend into hedgerows, rock outcroppings, or even animal burrows. The idea was simple. Don't just hide in nature, hide as nature. These camouflage positions were nearly impossible to detect from the air and gave soldiers both cover and line of sight, without revealing movement. Modern militaries and bushcrafters still use these lessons in concealment. If you're building a temporary shelter, choose materials that match your environment's texture and colour. Break up hard lines and shadows with brush or fabric. World War II manuals emphasized irregular patterns, because nature never grows in straight lines. This principle remains true for anyone practicing stealth camping or survival concealment today. The best shelter isn't always the strongest. Sometimes it's the one nobody sees. Modern bunkers are designed for precision warfare, but they rely on materials that fail when supply chains break. World War II shelters were built on principles of adaptability, thermal balance, and camouflage. They were designed to be constructed anywhere, with anything, and maintained by anyone. They weren't reliant on generators, prefab parts, or reinforced steel, and that's why they endure. The men who built them weren't just soldiers. They were innovators, forced to understand soil, airflow, moisture, and weight distribution in real time. Those lessons haven't aged a day. For anyone interested in survival, military history, or practical engineering, these designs are a blueprint for resilience. They remind us that real strength isn't in materials, it's in understanding the environment and using it to your advantage. If you found this guide valuable, subscribe to Echoes of Valor for more deep dives into forgotten wartime innovations that still shape survival thinking today. Share this episode with someone who respects the craftsmanship of the past, because the best lessons aren't in textbooks. They're buried in the soil, waiting to be rediscovered.